November 1975. Angola stands on the edge of independence after centuries of Portuguese colonial rule. 3 liberation movements compete for control of the newly freed nation. The MPLA fights from Luanda, holding the capital with fragile support. FNLA forces push south from Zaire, backed by American weapons and mercenaries. UNITA advances from the south, supported by Apartheid South Africa's military machine. Portugal withdraws, leaving no transition, no infrastructure, no unified government behind. The vacuum pulls in global powers, seeking influence across southern Africa's resource-rich landscape. Black Angolans watch foreign armies march across their soil in different uniforms. South African troops cross the border in armored columns, moving north toward Luanda. White soldiers from Pretoria's apartheid regime advance to prevent Black African socialism. MPLA leaders in Luanda send urgent messages to allies in Cuba and Moscow. Agostinho Neto, MPLA president, understands his forces cannot stop the South African advance. His soldiers lack heavy weapons, training, and the numbers to defend the capital. South African artillery begins shelling positions just 200 miles from Luanda. Havana receives the distress call in early November, days before Angola's independence date. Fidel Castro convenes military commanders to assess Cuba's capacity for African intervention. Cuban generals study maps showing South African positions advancing rapidly toward the capital. Intelligence reports confirm American CIA operatives coordinating FNLA and UNITA operations together. Castro makes the decision within hours. Cuba will send combat troops to Angola. The first Cuban soldiers board planes in Havana bound for Africa's Atlantic coast. They carry Soviet weapons, medical supplies, and orders to stop the South African army. Cuban transport planes land in Luanda under cover of darkness on November 7th. Black Cuban soldiers step onto African soil, speaking Spanish, carrying AK-47 rifles. MPLA fighters watch these unexpected allies arrive with tanks and artillery pieces behind them. The Cubans establish defensive positions around Luanda as South African forces approach closer. Radio intercepts reveal apartheid commanders expect to capture the capital within days. Cuban officers work alongside MPLA leaders, planning defensive strategies against the advancing columns. They dig trenches, position anti-tank weapons, and prepare for the first direct engagement. November 10th, 1975. Angola declares independence as battles rage across multiple fronts simultaneously throughout the country. South African forces reach the outskirts of Luanda, expecting light resistance from MPLA units. Cuban artillery opens fire on the advancing columns in the first major engagement. South African soldiers encounter unexpected resistance from disciplined, well-armed Cuban troops instead. Tank battles erupt across the coastal plains as Cuban crews engage apartheid armor. MPLA and Cuban forces coordinate attacks, pushing South African units back from the capital. The South African command realizes they face trained soldiers, not disorganized guerrilla fighters. Pretoria's generals demand answers about Cuban presence and capability in the theater. Radio traffic increases as apartheid forces call for reinforcements and air support urgently. Cuban anti-aircraft guns shoot down reconnaissance planes attempting to assess defensive positions clearly. Deaf soldiers gain confidence watching Cuban allies hold ground against Africa's strongest military. Black Angolans in the streets see white. South African prisoners captured by Cuban forces. The psychological impact reverses months of fear about the inevitable apartheid conquest of Angola. Stations in Kinshasa and Pretoria send urgent cables to Washington about Cuban intervention. American officials debate responses, while South African advances stall outside the Angolan capital. Henry Kissinger receives intelligence reports showing thousands of Cuban troops arriving weekly in Angola. The Ford administration faces a decision about escalating American involvement in the conflict. Congress debates covert funding for FNLA and UNITA. Cuban reinforcements continue landing daily. December 1975. Cuban troop numbers swell to over 15,000 combat soldiers deployed across Angola. Soviet ships deliver tanks, armored vehicles, and heavy artillery to Angola and ports continuously. Cuban forces launch coordinated offensives against South African positions in the Central Highlands. MPLA units advance alongside Cuban allies, recapturing towns lost to FNLA and UNITA earlier. South African commanders realize they cannot achieve military objectives without a massive escalation of forces. Pretoria's apartheid government faces international pressure as Cuban MPLA victories mount across battlefields. The Battle of Ebo becomes a turning point in the Angolan conflict's opening phase. South African armored armored columns attempt to break through the Cuban MPLA defensive lines blocking the route. Cuban tank crews engage in close-range combat against apartheid forces throughout the day. Artillery exchanges destroy buildings and infrastructure as both sides commit reserves to the fight. By nightfall, South African forces withdraw, leaving destroyed vehicles and abandoned positions behind. MPLA soldiers raise flags over recaptured territory as Cuban medics treat wounded from both sides. Black Cuban soldiers share rations with black Angolan fighters in the trenches after battle. They speak different languages but understand shared histories of colonialism and racial oppression together. Angolan civilians approach Cuban positions cautiously, bringing water and food to the foreign allies. Cuban officers explain their revolution to MPL commanders during planning sessions between engagements constantly. The alliance strengthens through combat experience and mutual respect forged under artillery fire daily. FNLA forces collapse in northern Angola as Cuban MPLA offensives overwhelm their defensive positions. Thousands of FNLA fighters flee across the Zaire border, abandoning American-supplied weapons behind. CIA operatives evacuate hastily as their proxy force disintegrates under coordinated Cuban attacks. American mercenaries hired to fight alongside the FNLA surrender or escape before Cuban forces arrive. UNITA retreats into southern Angola, maintaining guerrilla operations with South African support. Continuing quietly, January 1976. South Africa begins withdrawing regular military forces from Angola under mounting international diplomatic pressure. Apartheid commanders leave behind UNITA, allies with weapons, but no direct combat support anymore. Cuban forces control major cities, roads, and strategic positions across most of Angola's territory. MPLA establishes governmental authority backed by a Cuban military presence, ensuring security and stability. Agostinho Neto's government gains international recognition as Angola's legitimate ruling authority officially, but victory creates new complications as Cuban troops remain stationed across the country. MPLA leaders negotiate the terms of the Cuban military presence in newly independent Angola carefully. Some Angolan factions resent foreign soldiers, even allies, occupying their liberated nation's strategic positions. Cuban officers insist their mission remains defensive, protecting Angola from external apartheid aggression only. UNITA forces regroup in the bush, supplied by South African intelligence networks operating covertly. Sporadic attacks begin targeting Cuban patrols and administrative centers in remote regions. Cuban soldiers adapt to counterinsurgency operations in Angola's vast, difficult terrain and climate. They train MPLA forces in tactics, weapons, maintenance, and defensive strategies against guerrilla warfare. Black Cuban advisors work in Angolan villages, helping establish schools, clinics, and local governance. The mission expands beyond combat into nation-building, while insurgent threats persist across the countryside. MPLA officials depend heavily on Cuban military protection as they consolidate fragile authority nationwide. February 1976. Reports reach Havana about Cuban casualties from ambushes and landmine attacks in Angola. Castro faces domestic questions about the mission's duration and objectives in the African intervention. Cuban families receive news of sons killed defending a country most had never heard of before. The commitment deepens as casualties mount, but withdrawal would abandon the MPLA to certain defeat. Soviet advisors arrive in Luanda, coordinating weapons, deliveries, and strategic planning with Cuban commanders. Angola becomes a Cold War proxy battlefield with Cuban soldiers as the primary ground forces. UNITA launches coordinated attacks on Cuban supply lines running through central Angola's remote regions. Ambushes destroy trucks carrying food, ammunition, and medical supplies to isolated Cuban positions regularly. Cuban patrols increase in frequency and intensity, searching for insurgent bases hidden in dense bush. MPLA intelligence provides limited information about UNITA movements and support networks in local villages. Cuban officers struggle with language barriers and cultural differences while conducting operations among Angolans. Tensions emerge between Cuban advisors and MPLA commanders over strategy, authority, and operational control. South African aircraft violate Angolan airspace, conducting reconnaissance missions over Cuban defensive positions below. Cuban anti-aircraft crews track the flights rights but lack orders to engage unless directly attacked. Intelligence reports indicate South Africa maintains covert supply routes to Namibian territory. MPLA requests Cuban support for operations along the southern border against infiltration routes. Cuban forces deployed 2 border regions, establishing bases to interdict South African support for insurgents. March 1976. Cuban patrol encounters a UNITA ambush in eastern provinces near the Zambian border. Automatic weapons fire erupts from concealed positions surrounding the Cuban convoy on the road. Cuban soldiers return fire, calling for reinforcements as casualties mount in the extended firefight. MPLA units arrive hours later, finding destroyed vehicles and dead Cuban soldiers along the roadside. The ambush demonstrates UNITA's capability to strike Cuban forces despite the MPLA Cuban territorial control. Cuban commanders demand better intelligence and coordination from MPLA partners after the deadly ambush. Officials acknowledge weaknesses in their intelligence networks and local support in contested regions. Join Cuban across areas where UNITA operates with civilian population support. Cuban soldiers begin questioning villagers through interpreters, seeking information about insurgent movements and hideouts. Angolan civilians fear retaliation from UNITA if they cooperate with Cuban MPLA forces investigating attacks. The silence from villages creates operational blindness for Cuban forces hunting elusive insurgent units. Cuban officers recognize the pattern from their own revolutionary experience in the Sierra Maestra. Winning military battles means nothing without population support against determined guerrilla resistance and tactics. MPLA lacks the political infrastructure to compete with UNITA's tribal networks in southern Angola. Cuban advisors begin training political officers in grassroots organizing and community engagement strategies. April 1976. Cuban troop levels stabilize around 25,000 soldiers deployed across Angola's vast national territory. Havana commits to a long-term presence, protecting the MPLA government from external and internal threats simultaneously. Castro publicly declares Cuba's solidarity with African liberation movements, fighting colonialism and apartheid together. The intervention becomes a cornerstone of Cuban foreign policy and revolutionary identity on display. But in Angola's villages and bush, Cuban soldiers face daily dangers from an enemy they cannot easily locate or defeat. UNITA fighters blend into civilian populations, attacking unexpectedly, then vanishing into familiar terrain and communities. Cuban casualties accumulate slowly but steadily from ambushes, mines, and small-scale engagements across remote areas. MPLA forces prove unable to secure territory without continuous Cuban military presence and support backing them. The mission extends indefinitely, as withdrawal would collapse. The government Cuba sacrificed to defend. South African intelligence monitors the situation, waiting for opportunities to reignite conflict through UNITA. Cuban soldiers write letters home, describing a war without clear front lines or easy victories. They patrol endlessly through hostile territory, never certain who supports them among Angolan civilians. MPLA leaders depend on Cuban protection while struggling to build legitimate authority among their own people. The revolution Cuba defended militarily remains incomplete, politically vulnerable to internal division and external pressure. Tension builds as Cuban forces realize they cannot simply win and leave Angola in May 1976. Cuban intelligence detects increased South African military activity along Angola's southern border region. Reconnaissance reports show weapons convoys crossing from Namibia into UNITA-controlled territories at night. Apartheid South Africa resumes covert support for insurgents despite official withdrawal from direct combat. MPLA requests that Cuban forces establish permanent bases in the south to block infiltration routes. Cuban commanders deploy battalions to remote border positions with limited supply lines and reinforcement. The soldiers dig defensive positions in arid terrain, preparing for prolonged isolation and engagement. UNITA attacks escalate in frequency and sophistication across southern Angola's scattered Cuban outposts. Insurgents use South African-supplied mortars to Cuban positions from concealed locations nearby. Cuban soldiers endure nighttime bombardments, unable to locate attackers in the darkness effectively. Casualties mount from indirect fire as UNITA avoids direct confrontation with superior Cuban forces. Medical evacuations become increasingly difficult as insurgents target helicopters with anti-aircraft weapons provided. Cuban medics treat wounded soldiers in field hospitals lacking proper equipment and supplies constantly. MPLA Civilian administrators in regions face assassination attempts and intimidation campaigns systematically. Government representatives travel only with Cuban military escorts through the hostile territories they claim to govern. Villages refuse cooperation, fearing UNITA retribution more than MPLA authority backed by foreign soldiers. Cuban patrols encounter abandoned settlements, emptied before their arrival by populations fleeing both sides. The war becomes a struggle for civilian loyalty that military force alone cannot achieve. June 1976. A Cuban convoy traveling between southern bases disappears without radio contact along a remote route. Search patrols find the burned vehicles days later. Bodies stripped of weapons and identification. UNITA leaves no survivors, sending a message about the cost of Cuban presence in Angola. Cuban commanders impose stricter security protocols, limiting movement and increasing isolation of forward positions. Morale declines among soldiers stationed far from Luanda, facing constant danger with no clear progress. MPLA officials in Havana's embassy request additional Cuban troops to expand territorial control further. Castro's government faces economic strain in supporting military operations thousands of miles from Cuba. Soviet subsidies help sustain the mission but create dependency that complicates Cuban decision-making autonomy. Cuban soldiers rotate home after 12-month deployments, replaced by new recruits facing the same stalemate. Veterans return to Cuba with stories of inconclusive combat against an invisible enemy they couldn't defeat. July 1976, UNITA launches a coordinated offensive against multiple Cuban positions simultaneously across southern provinces. Insurgents attack with unusual discipline and timing, suggesting improved South African training and planning. Cuban defenders repel the assaults, but suffer significant casualties during the sustained engagements. Radio intercepts reveal South African military advisors directing UNITA operations from inside Namibian territory. MP demands Cuban cross-border strikes against South African bases supporting the insurgent offensive. Cuban commanders refuse, understanding that such action would escalate into full-scale war with apartheid forces. The disagreement exposes tensions between Cuban military caution and MPLA political demands for aggressive action. MPLA leaders accuse Cubans of limiting their commitment, while Cuban officers cite strategic realities. Joint planning sessions become contentious as battlefield. Frustrations strain the alliance under pressure. Cuban soldiers question their mission's purpose when their MPLA allies criticize the defensive strategies employed. UNITA exploits the friction, increasing attacks to widen the rift between Cuban and MPLA forces. August 1976. South African aircraft conduct bombing raids against Cuban positions near the Namibian border openly. Apartheid forces claim self-defense, while destroying Cuban anti-aircraft installations and supply depots systematically. Cuban casualties spike as South Africa escalates direct military action without declaring formal war. Castro protests internationally, but lacks capability to retaliate against South African air superiority. The MPLA government issues statements condemning apartheid aggression while depending entirely on Cuban defense capability. Cuban soldiers watch South African jets strike their positions with impunity from above. Anti-aircraft weapons prove insufficient against modern apartheid Air Force bombing campaigns conducted regularly. Soldiers dig deeper trenches and bunkers, preparing for bombardments they cannot prevent or stop. Supplies become scarce as South African raids destroy warehouses and transportation infrastructure supporting Cuban operations. Cuban officers request Soviet surface-to-air missiles to counter the intensifying aerial threat effectively. September 1976. Soviet SAM systems arrive in Angola aboard cargo ships, escorted by naval vessels. Cuban crews train rapidly on the sophisticated anti-aircraft missile technology under Soviet instructor guidance. The first South African reconnaissance flight encounters a missile launch over southern Angola's airspace. The aircraft explodes, sending debris across the bush as Cuban soldiers celebrate the downturn. South African bombing raids decrease immediately as apartheid commanders reassess the changed tactical environment. But the victory brings new complications as Soviet involvement deepens. Cuban dependency on external support. Moscow provides weapons, but demands influence over MPLA policy decisions and Cuban operational strategies. Cuban commanders navigate between Soviet advisors and MP demands while maintaining their own government's interests. The mission becomes increasingly complex politically, While remaining stalemated militarily on the ground, UNITA adapts tactics, avoiding areas with heavy Cuban presence while controlling populations in remote regions. October 1976. Cuban patrols discover evidence of American weapons recently delivered to UNITA forces in eastern Angola. CIA support continues covertly, despite congressional restrictions on Angolan intervention funding officially imposed earlier. Cuban intelligence photographs American-made rifles, ammunition, and equipment captured from UNITA fighters after skirmishes. The Cold War proxy conflict intensifies as superpower involvement expands. Despite public denials, Cuban soldiers realize they fight not just UNITA insurgents, but American-backed destabilization efforts too. Security forces arrests suspected UNITA sympathizers in Luanda and other Cuban-controlled urban centers. Detentions occur without due process as the MPLA implements harsh counterinsurgency measures against civilian populations. Cuban advisors object to indiscriminate arrests that alienate populations MPLA needs for legitimate governance. MPLA officials ignore Cuban concerns, asserting sovereign authority over internal security matters independently. The rift widens as Cuban soldiers witness their allies employing repressive tactics, undermining popular support. November 1976. 1 year after independence, Angola remains divided between MPLA-controlled cities and UNITA-held rural territories. Cuban forces maintain security in urban areas while insurgents dominate vast countryside regions unchallenged. The stalemate becomes permanent as neither side achieves a decisive advantage despite ongoing combat operations. Cuban casualties totaled over 200 dead, with hundreds more wounded during the first year. Havana commits to continued presence, understanding that withdrawal means MPLA government collapse and mission failure. Cuban soldiers celebrate Angola's first independence anniversary alongside MPLA officials in Luanda's streets. But outside the capital, the war continues without resolution or a clear path toward victory. UNITA controls more territory now than immediately after independence. Despite the Cuban military intervention's success, South African support sustains the insurgency indefinitely through Namibian infiltration routes that Cuban forces cannot close. MPLA governance remains limited to areas where Cuban soldiers actively patrol and defend. December 1976. Reports reach Cuban positions about civilian massacres in UNITA-controlled villages, punishing suspected MPLA collaboration. Refugees flee toward Cuban lines, describing atrocities committed by insurgents, enforcing loyalty through terror. Cuban soldiers establish refugee camps, providing shelter and food to displaced Angolans escaping violence. The humanitarian crisis overwhelms limited Cuban medical and logistical resources stretched across vast territories. MPLA lacks the infrastructure to absorb refugees or provide basic services in government-controlled areas. Cuban officers realize the war extends far beyond military confrontation into social collapse and humanitarian catastrophe. Soldiers trained for combat find themselves distributing food, treating sick children, and managing refugee populations. The mission evolves into indefinite occupation, maintaining fragile stability rather than achieving victory and withdrawal. Cuban families in Havana question the sacrifices sons remain in Angola. Years beyond the initial deployment, Castro defends the intervention as an internationalist duty, while domestic economic problems worsen from the expense. January 1977. UNITA ambushes a Cuban patrol in central Angola, capturing 5 soldiers alive. The prisoners become propaganda tools, as UNITA parades them before international journalists visiting rebel territory. The Cuban government demands their release while negotiating secretly through intermediaries with the UNITA leadership. The captured soldiers appear in photographs, gaunt and frightened, held in jungle camps by insurgents. Cuban forces intensify operations searching for the prisoners. Location without success across vast search areas. MPLA officials publicly demand the execution of UNITA prisoners in government custody as retaliation for captures. Cuban commanders refuse to participate in such actions, creating another public disagreement between allies. The prisoners become symbols of the war's brutality and the complex moral terrain. Cuban soldiers navigate. Months pass without resolution as the captured Cubans remain in UNITA custody. Their fate uncertain. Cuban morale suffers as soldiers understand capture means prolonged captivity or death at insurgent hands. February 1977. Soviet advisors push for expanded Cuban offensive operations to eliminate UNITA bases in eastern regions. Cuban commanders resist, citing insufficient intelligence and the risk of overextending already strained forces. MPLA sides with Soviet recommendations, creating command structure tensions that undermine operational effectiveness severely. Cuban officers implement limited offensives under protest, suffering casualties in poorly planned operations through hostile territory. The operations fail to locate the main UNITA forces, which disperse and regroup after the Cuban units withdraw. Cuban soldiers questioned the mission's direction as their sacrifices produced no measurable progress toward peace. Letters home describe frustration with endless patrols through dangerous terrain, achieving nothing permanent or meaningful. Some Cuban units report declining discipline as soldiers lose faith in mission objectives and leadership. Cuban commanders rotate problem units back to Cuba, replacing them with fresh troops lacking veteran experience. The cycle perpetuates as inexperienced soldiers make mistakes that cause lives in unforgiving combat environments. March 1977. South African forces conduct a major cross-border raid, destroying a Cuban base near the Namibian frontier. Apartheid commandos attack at dawn, overwhelming defenders with superior firepower and surprise tactical advantage. Cuban survivors retreat under heavy fire, abandoning equipment and positions. To South African forces, the raid demonstrates South Africa's continued capability to strike Cuban forces despite missile defenses elsewhere. MPLA demands Cuban retaliation while Cuban commanders assess their vulnerability along the extended southern border. Cuban reinforcements deployed to the border, but South African forces withdraw before engagement occurs. The hit-and-run tactics frustrate Cuban military doctrine, built on conventional warfare and fixed defensive positions. Cuban soldiers fortify remaining border bases, expecting additional raids without knowing when or where exactly. The anticipation creates constant stress as troops maintain high alert indefinitely without respite or relief. South Africa achieves strategic effect by forcing Cuban resources toward a defensive posture rather than offensive operations. April 1977, Cuban intelligence discovers UNITA receiving Chinese weapons through Zambian territory in eastern Angola. The insurgency benefits from multiple international supporters, complicating Cuban efforts to isolate and defeat them. MPLA lacks the diplomatic capability to pressure neighboring countries, hosting UNITA supply networks and bases. Cuban forces cannot pursue insurgents across international borders without triggering broader regional conflict escalation. UNITA operates from a sanctuary, attacking and then retreating across borders that Cuban soldiers cannot legally cross. Cuban soldiers watch insurgents escape after attacks, forbidden from pursuit by political constraints they don't control. The frustration builds as military success becomes impossible under restrictions imposed by geopolitical realities. Cuban casualties continue from attacks launched from safe havens that Cuban forces cannot eliminate or neutralize. The MPLA government proves unable to secure diplomatic solutions, while Cuban soldiers bear combat costs daily. The mission's limitations become clear as Cuban forces realize military action alone cannot resolve Angola's conflict. May 1977. 18 months after the intervention, Cuban troop levels exceeded 35,000 soldiers deployed across Angola. The commitment grows despite no clear progress toward conditions allowing withdrawal with mission success. The Cuban economy strains under the burden of sustaining large-scale military operations in Africa indefinitely. Castro publicly read Cuba's commitment to African liberation while privately seeking exit strategies from advisors. MPLA dependency on Cuba presence increases as its own military capability fails to develop adequately. Cuban trainers work with MPLA forces, attempting to build a capable Angolan army independent of foreign support. Progress remains slow as MPLA recruits lack education, experience, and motivation compared to Cuban soldiers. Corruption within the MPLA military structure diverts resources away from training and equipment to personal enrichment. Cuban advisors report systematic problems within the MPLA organization that Cuban presence alone cannot fix. The nation-building mission falters as MPLA governance fails to establish legitimacy beyond Cuban-controlled zones. June 1977. A Cuban unit in the Central Highlands encounters civilian villagers forced by UNITA to plant landmines. The insurgents threaten families, compelling cooperation under duress to target Cuban and MPLA forces. Cuban soldiers detain the villagers, facing the impossible choice between punishment and understanding coercion. Security demands arrests, while Cuban officers recognize the civilians as victims, not willing collaborators. The incident illustrates the war's moral complexity and the population's entrapment between competing forces. Cuban forces release the villagers with warnings, creating another friction point with the MPLA security apparatus. MPLA officials accuse Cubans of weakness, while Cuban commanders cite the political necessity of winning civilian support. The disagreement reflects fundamentally different understandings of counterinsurgency and governance between the allies. Cuban soldiers increasingly operate independently, avoiding MPLA oversight they view as counterproductive to mission success. The alliance phrase as operational. Cooperation declines despite continued formal political statements of solidarity. July 1977. Reports arrive in Havana about a failed attack repelled by a Cuban unit. The official version celebrates Cuban military prowess and commitment to the African liberation struggle. But soldiers, letters home describe the chaotic firefight. Terror. The randomness of survival. Cuban families receive contradictory information about the war's progress and their sons' safety in Angola. Public support in Cuba begins to question the sacrifice for a distant conflict without a visible end. Castro addresses the nation, framing Angola as Cuba's contribution to the global anti-imperialist resistance movement. The speech inspires some, but fails to satisfy families grieving sons lost in African battlefields. Cuban society divides quietly between supporters of the internationalist mission and those questioning its cost. The government suppresses open dissent, while casualties continue arriving home in coffins from Luanda regularly. Angola becomes Cuba's Vietnam, a grinding commitment without a clear victory or an acceptable exit strategy available. August 1977. Cuban positions throughout Angola remain under constant threat from UNITA attacks and South African raids. Soldiers endured the danger, the isolation, the disillusionment of fighting a war that never ends. MPLA government controls cities but not the countryside. Governance but not legitimacy. Power but not peace. Cuban forces hold the line, maintaining a stalemate that could persist for years or decades. The mission continues, unresolved, as soldiers wait for orders that never come to withdraw. In Luanda, Cuban and MPLA flags fly together above government buildings protected by Cuban guards. In the bush, Cuban patrols move cautiously through hostile territory, hunting an enemy everywhere and nowhere. In Havana, families light candles for sons serving. In a revolution, an ocean away, the war grinds on. The struggle persists. The end remains distant and unclear.